كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. MashaAllah, welcome back to second semester of the second year of the fiqh program. Alhamdulillah, in this one we are going to be discussing, this is the module. So essentially what we're going to be discussing here is what exactly is Sufism, because unfortunately it became a very controversial word in the last 100 years, you could say, or just a bit less than that. Alhamdulillah, things are settling now and people are understanding the benefits of Sufism. So what we're going to do in these 50, we're going to try to understand what Sufism is. We'll go through definitions. For example, tazkiyah, purification, discuss what Sufism is, because there's just so much Sufism out there which detractors or opposers of Sufism say is Sufism, but which is actually not Sufism. Hopefully that's clear. So we're going to discuss what is not Sufism as well, the definition, what it includes. In terms of Sufism, as to what it includes, part of Sufism is having a mentor. That's a very important aspect of Sufism. Another aspect of Sufism is what's the benefit of that companionship, where does it come from? Muslim's companionship with his companions. Sometimes there's an official system of taking the oath as such, the bay'ah as such. So that discussion, how people are appointed as khulafa or as muqaddams or as can now carry on the tradition of a sheikh to assist other people. So there's that discussion about aspects of protecting the self and removing the blameworthy traits and traits. So what exactly are those issues? For example, we'll be discussing what exactly is hasad and anger and sincerity and patience and tawakkul, and then reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, satisfaction with his decree and gratitude. What exactly are some of the other more specific ideas within Sufism that you hear from Sufis, like what exactly is khalwa, what exactly is the divine love, kashf, unveiling, ilham, although that's a general kind of term, inspiration, karamat, and so on. Then inshallah we'll also discuss some of the famous early Sufis, at least, right, to understand they're kind of agreed upon by everybody. So these are the discussions inshallah we're going to have. So inshallah we'll see you we'll discuss all of this in the next 15. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So a few of the sources that we're going to use, one of them is going to be Al-Risala Al-Makkiyah, which is by Sheikh Qutbuddin al-Dimashqi, Sheikh Qutbuddin al-Dimashqi, and this is a book that's been used multiple times, especially in the Indian subcontinent, multiple other places, though it's called a Risala al-Makkiyah because the Sheikh was in Makkah Mukarrama, originally from Damascus, Sham. We're also going to be taking some content from a book on Sufism called Sheikh Abdul Qadir Isa, again Sheikh Abdul Qadir Isa, and then there'll be some other things from a Haji Imdadullah from the Indian subcontinent. So we'll try to get different things from different books so that we can understand what's going on. And let me start it off. So Sufism, if you tell somebody to describe Sufism to you, you'll get multiple definitions. Sufism there's some theory to it, but I would say that it's mostly based on practice. And the purpose of it ultimately is to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to gain some ihsan in one's life. So there's multiple objectives that come together. One of the objectives of Sufism, you could say, is to renounce the world. Renounce the world doesn't mean that you go into a cave and you then literally just survive on some kind of rough foods or so, although some people have done that. But it's to live within the community, but renounce the world from the heart. So we lose the love of the world from the heart. Though we have it in our hands, we're using it. In fact, somebody could be a millionaire and a Sufi at the same time, and doing a lot of good work with the wealth Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given. So wealth is not necessarily an antithesis to Sufism. It's about where the heart is and what our indulgence is and what our love is and what are we seeking ultimately. If we're seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that is the focus of Sufism, which is that we attain love of Allah. So you'll see it is discussed at different times in different ways. So one, there's going to be a focus of love of Allah, because once a person has love of Allah properly, then they can't love anything else. And anything else that they do love is through the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That can be considered to be one of the great objectives of Islam. And of course, Sufism is the part that helps to get us in that direction. So that's one thing. Number two, you'll speak about, so actually that's two things. One is renunciation of the world, and the other one is developing a love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The third objective, you could say, the way people have discussed it, is of cleansing the heart, cleansing the conduct, our physical external self and also our internal self, from all blameworthy traits, blameworthy expressions, blameworthy behavior, blameworthy expression, blameworthy conduct. So for example, to change things like having hatred, sensitivity to the wrong things, then excessive greed, envy and lust and desire and addictions to the wrong things, and to replace that with a love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with love for people for the right reason, contentment and satisfaction, lots of shukr and gratitude, being able to be patient and just deal with adversities, and praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and just trying to please Him. So that's removing blameworthy traits, blameworthy expressions and so on. So that's another aspect of it. A fourth aspect of it is we can discuss as ihsan. Ihsan means to eventually enter a state where we could say that we are worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in everything else that we do as though we see Him. Of course, you can never see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world. In the hereafter, He'll make a special, He'll make it special. There'll be a special vision that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide for us, which everybody's looking for. All the believers are looking for, and they only want to go to paradise, some of them, because you'll be able to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in paradise. So that's one thing. But what's important is that you can't see Him in this world, but you're supposed to do everything as though you see Him, because the purpose of that, or that's a consequence of believing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always watching us. He's behind everything. For example, when you want to buy something, and you didn't need that particular car before, you probably wouldn't even notice them on the streets when you see them, because we ignore a lot of things. However, if we decide that we want to buy this particular car, then you will notice that you'll suddenly start seeing that car more than ever before. It is not the case that suddenly there's been so many cars that have appeared on the street like that. It's just that they've appeared in our eyes now. They've always been there. They've always been there. It's just that since we're interested now, we notice it. You have to know about something, so the ilm is very important. And you have to recognize it and acknowledge for you to actually then even notice it. Otherwise, we can miss things all the time. Some people might think they don't miss anything. We actually miss a lot of things. And the simplest way to say that, or to see that, is just think of a particular car that you've never focused on before, and just start thinking about it, and then you will start seeing it everywhere. Right? As long as there's enough of them on the street, you'll actually start seeing them everywhere. Right? So that is the understanding that if you don't have knowledge, and Sufism tries to provide a knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that we start realizing that His effect, His creation is everywhere, because it is. There's nothing beyond Allah's creation. Everything is Allah's creation, but we just don't notice it because we are so distracted by the dunya. So that's another purpose of Sufism. Another way of looking at Sufism is a very interesting one, which is that Sufism is one of the most important paradigms or facets of Islam. Okay, what do I mean by that? So I'm going to give you a brief overview which you can use, inshallah, if you're studying this, maybe you're teaching somewhere, maybe, you can use this for da'wah. A lot of people, when asked about what Islam is, or when they're told to describe Islam to somebody and discuss Islam to someone, what they usually end up saying is that Islam is based on 5 pillars. And yes, Islam is based on 5 pillars, but what we're talking about here as in terms of based on 5 pillars is people will be referring to the Salat, Zakat, Hajj, fasting, and the Shahada. And yes, that's important. But that is not all of deen. That's just the ibadah aspect of deen. That's the worship aspect of the deen. So we've been covering the fiqh in the classes because this is a Hanafi fiqh course. They've added Sufism here because Sufism makes fiqh better. Otherwise people are going to try to find ways to cheat the system, cheat the fiqh as such. So the way I like to describe Islam to anybody new is in a very comprehensive way. And the way is that, look, there are 5 paradigms of Islam. There's 5 facets. The first one is belief, aqeedah, which we covered last year in the first year of the course. Aqeedah, to understand who we are, where we are, what we're here for, why are we here, and where we're going, where did we come from, what exists beyond the observable phenomena, and so on. So that was aqeedah. Once we've got that, then comes the second paradigm, the second dimension of Islam, which is the ibadat. That's where the 5 pillars come into, right? That's our devotion to Allah. However, as human beings and social beings, we do a lot more than that, and we deal with a lot more than that. So then the next discussion is regarding our interaction with other people and things around us, essentially everything, all that exists around us, animals, the nature, the trees, the space, everything. So now in that regard, there are 2 categories. So that's the third and fourth dimension of Islam. The third one is when we deal with them on a contractual, on a contractual level, on a mu'amala level, right? Which means in a dealing, in a financial or some kind of contract, or some kind of exchange. For example, buying or selling something, renting something, marriage is a contract. So those are the contractual aspects. They're called mu'amalat in Arabic, right? That's the third dimension. The fourth dimension is when we deal with people on a non-contractual level. It's just common decency, chivalry, just being decent, right? And that is called mu'asharat, just civil relationship, just civil, decency as such. That's mu'amala, how you deal with your neighbors, the elders, the young, the weak ones, the poor ones, the animals, the space around you. So those are the 4 dimensions: the belief, the worship, the mu'amala, which means the contractual dealings, transactions, and number 4 was the social dealings, and then number 5 was ihsan. And this section, which is the Sufism, that is one of the most important ones after the first one, because the first one tells you where we are and what we're doing, and then the others teach us how to interact with Allah and with others around us, and then the last one is what keeps the inside strong enough to be able to do all of the other dimensions and do them well. Because without the love of Allah and without having a good heart, then we won't be able to do that which is good in terms of fiqh or in our understanding, and all of that will become corrupted in a sense. From these 5 dimensions, as we can see, Sufism can be placed in that 5th section, which is just to control everything, for that part to be sound, for that part to be serviced, so that we feel good about doing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, through the fiqh that we study, through the contracts that we have with others. Right, then there's, once we go beyond that, then there's another way to understand Sufism, which is that it's a path to Allah. Now that's going to be discussed later, but one is a sayr ilallah, and then there's sayr fillah. And that is various different, you can say, parts of the journey. So a lot of people, they describe Sufism as being the path, and taking the path, initiating the path, entering the path. We have that. So in Arabic, the word is at-tariq or suluk. Suluk of the tariq. The tariq is the path, and suluk means traversing that path, journeying on that path. Usually we do that, with a sheikh as such. So there's certain things that have to be, for example, Imam Ghazali rahimahullah was a big voice in this particular aspect, where he could be even considered somewhat to be responsible for mainstreaming Sufism, right? Taking it kind of beyond its mystical aspects or mysterious aspects, and making it very easily understandable and attractive to the common folk. I mean, there's lots of people who've done that, but Imam Ghazali rahimahullah is definitely responsible for a large part of that. So his books are very clear. So in one of them, for example, which is a book that's attributed to Minhajul Abidin, where he discusses the path as 10 valleys you have to get through. So ultimately you're trying to get to your destination, but there's mountains and valleys you have to go through. So one of the most important valleys that he speaks about is the valley of knowledge. Because without knowledge, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to know what's the way. If you don't have knowledge of the path, you don't have guidance, you don't have a GPS system, you don't have, a navigation system, you just don't know which way to go, right? You're going to have to ask somebody. So there's various ways to do that. So the first one is knowledge. Without knowledge, you don't get anywhere. So knowledge to understand what we've done wrong in the past and where we're going, and to straighten our path, and what's easier ways to get to that path, efficient ways to take us across, what are the pitfalls of the way. So that's a discussion of the tariq, of the suluk of the tariq, right? And then after that he discusses, I think the second one he discusses is tawbah and repentance, because we can't carry baggage with us. If we want to be on this path of Sufism, which is ultimately to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to make tawbah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us. May Allah forgive us for all the wrongs that we have done, right? And all of our blameworthy traits. So we need to shed all of that so that we can go. And then there's various different discussions that he makes on the path, like you have to have sabr, you're going to have shukr. So you're going to have sabr and patience, because things do get difficult, right? You get opposition, you'll just have difficulties and hurdles. There may be calamities or difficulties and other challenges that might come about. How we're supposed to deal with that? Being content in one's life. So this is all the discussion of Sufism and the path and the suluk. And so now let me read to you a bit from the text, as I said, of the book by Sheikh al-Dimashqi regarding tasawwuf that he wrote. This very, very popular work. So we'll start off with a reading from some of that in the beginning, Ar-Risala al-Makkiyah. So suluk, another word is tariqah, which essentially means a road or a path. So because this is a kind of a journey you take, a lot of people refer to this as the path, because Sufism is a path. We'll get to the discussion of the literal meaning of Sufism later. So this means adornment of character. This is one definition. Suluk of the tariqah, or suluk, the path, and the tariqah, this means adornment of character by the elimination of things like hasad, envy, miserliness or bukhl, riya or show of or ostentation, pride or kibr, self-conceit, right? Self-conceit, which means ujub, and etc. All the blameworthy traits, essentially, is to get rid of that, eliminate that, and then to imbue oneself and adorn oneself with all the noble attributes such as sakhawa, which means generosity, then ikhlas and sincerity, tawadu, humility, and tadhallul, inferiority. Not, I think that's a bad translation actually. It means humility, right? Humility, to be humble in front of Allah. So all of this so that we gain the ability to reach of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We gain the ability to reach Allah by eliminating these bad characteristics and trying to imbue the good characteristics. A person gains what they call the malaka, the capability of reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's essentially the purpose of this, is to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, another definition of the Sufis, the terminology, tariqah means the traversing of the stages, the manazil, Manzil is a stage. Manazil is basically when you're traveling, you reach different markers on the street, whether that be junctions on the highway or the motorway, different exits as they call them, or different service stations until you get to your final destination in the journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first portal, so now this is very important, you can't do this path without Sharia. So the first portal of tariqah is the Sharia. That's essentially what we're studying mostly, pretty much in this course, this whole BA course about the Hanafi madhab. That is all Sharia. That's essential Sharia. Sharia is essentially is the external laws. You can't get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you don't fulfill those. Tasawwuf and Sufism is not this thing that you just sit and one day a week or few days a week or some parts of the day and you chant some things. And then after that you can do whatever you want. It's not that. That is not Sufism. That is a form of Sufism that some people have made it, even non-Muslims, right? They'll read books by Rumi, Imam Rumi rahimahullah and others, and then they'll do a few chants or utterances or a few different practices like that, and then think that it's done even though they don't even actually believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's kind of weird, right? Or they don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way they should do. So the first portal of tariqah is the Sharia itself. In short, the engrossment in the ibadah and worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by showing proper submissiveness and subservience to the Sharia, and the resolution and steadfastness in the quest for the divine pleasure. All of this is actually called tariqah. You'll see from many of the quotes that all of the ulama of tasawwuf, especially of the earlier times, said there's no way you can reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you're going to obscure his laws, if you're going to ignore the rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set down. The initial stages of tariqah is to put aside the concessions, Ya Allah, the discretions and the various different you can say discretions of the Sharia, and to impose on oneself not just the obligations but also the mustahabbat, the mustahsan acts, which basically means the optional acts of nafil prayer, because you begin to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much that you actually want to do these things. So it's not about just trying to fulfill the absolute basics. By fulfilling the basics, you'll just kind of qualify to get near the path. But after that, you actually have to do all the additional stuff to actually travel the path afterwards. It's just a basic qualification to fulfill the obligations and to avoid the haram. That's just basic qualification. If you want to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to do a lot. We have to do a lot more. And that's why the mustahab, mustahsan and recommended acts are what's necessary. So for example, a person is permitted to do nafil prayers sitting down, even without reason. You're allowed to do. You can't do obligatory prayers. You've learned that in your fiqh. But nafil, optional prayers, can be done sitting down. However, you get much more reward, so it's mustahab to stand up and perform those prayers. So for the people of tariqah, they say that it's essential for them to adopt the best and most meritorious method, the azima, as we call the optimal methods, rather than always take discretion. Yes, if there's a need, then taking discretions is completely fine. Discretions are for times of need. It's not to make it a habit. Unfortunately, many of us make discretions our norm, our habit, and we just go by that. We just think we live in the West or whatever it is. So that's why we can just take discretion, all the time. And discretions are to be taken sometimes, not all the time. That's why the end goal of tariqah, the nihaya, right? According to Junaid al-Baghdadi rahimahullah, is one of the biggest names in tasawwuf, right? Is to come towards the beginning. Ya Allah, Ya Allah, right? The main aspect, the way to get to the end of this path is to solidify the beginning. This is a very important point. The nihaya, the end goal of tariqah, according to Junaid al-Baghdadi rahimahullah, is to come towards the bidayah or the bidayat, right, which is the beginning. Now, how do you interpret this? Some have interpreted this statement of Junaid al-Baghdadi rahimahullah to mean that this is referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The end goal of this whole thing is the reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you can't reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until you come to the beginning. And the beginning is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, in the sense that He is the originator of everything. He is the beginner of everything. And ultimately He is the abode of return and the goal of everything as well. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, unto Him do all things return. Also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, to Him you will be returned. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ was addressed in the Quran saying, unto your Rabb, unto your Lord is the end goal of all affairs. So now the person who's on this path, the one who wants to gain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who's on Sufism essentially, is called a Salik, from the word suluk. Salik means the one who's the student of this path, the traverser of this path, the aspirant, the seeker. There's multiple words that they use in English for this as well. So the Salik, or the seeker, has turned himself in entirety to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When he focuses and gets to that beginning, then he will have attained the goal as well, he's saying, right? Another interpretation of this statement of Junaid al-Baghdadi is that when the aspirant turns towards his beginning, he will then reach the end that he's looking for. What does that mean? What is his beginning? So his beginning is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created him in his mother's womb, bestowed on him his external form, so gave him the limbs and the body form, and infused him with the ruh and the spirit. And then besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he actually did not have, if he thinks towards that who did I have, who protected me in my stomach? Not my mother. That was just something she was doing, she was carrying. Yes, she was eating maybe correctly and she was being careful and so on, but ultimately who designed all of that system in the heart? So when he realizes that he actually did not have any protector or sustainer except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he will reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a person is going to have some very good contemplation and reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Humility is required for him to get to this stage, to then have complete trust in Allah, just as he recognizes that he had complete trust in Allah without even doing it consciously, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made him an embryo, a fetus, right? So at that time he was in his purest form as well, completely devoid of any kind of evil qualities, no malice, no self-conceit, no pride, nothing. He was free of all defects. And he was at that time in such a, and you'll see the benefit of this later, but at that time he was so unaware of himself that he was unaware of even his own ego. He was even unaware that he could negate his ego, that there is even such a thing. And that is ultimately what you call fana'ul fana, which is where we're still trying to reach, is that we want to get rid of our ego so that we do everything purely and easily for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you have an ego, then we do it for ulterior motives. We do it to get something, to achieve something, to make a point or something like that. The perspective of Sufism is that we give ourselves completely to Allah. So we're doing everything but purely for His sake. There's no ego in there. However, sometimes you could have controlled the ego. People control their ego by knowing they've controlled their ego. And that's still not there, because there's still something else that we're fighting against. A person is supposed to get beyond that and not even have the ego in mind. So it's just so much Allah, Allah, Allah for him, all over and everywhere, that he doesn't even recognize there's an ego. That doesn't even matter anymore to him. So that's what he's saying, is that that's the same situation a person had when they were in the state, when they in their status as a fetus, right? They had no ego. There was no ego. You were just completely with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Similarly, when the Salik eventually transforms their moral condition to resemble the state that he had possessed initially in his mother's womb, then it will be said that he has attained the goal. So that's what Imam Junaid may have been speaking about. And this is what is considered to be the state of precise perfection. A state of perfection for Sufis is when they reach that, right? That is also called a state of perfect abdiyya, slave, to being a slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, servitude. When a person is able to free themselves from the various different promptings and vestiges of the nafs. Now, that's the basic beginning and end, right? So a person can't reach the end without going to the beginning. That was the discussion, an interesting way of discussing that. However, there is a path, and as I said, there are manazil, right? Which means that there are stages and ranks, right? On this path. So likewise then, for every part of the journey, if we were to segment it, there's a beginning and an end as well of every part of the journey. That's a very interesting point. There's a beginning and an end of every part of the journey. A point of beginning and a point of ending. Obviously for every part, so while there's the big ending and the big beginning of the overall journey, we have to then break it up into smaller sections, and for each one of them there's a beginning and an ending. You can't reach the ending unless you do the beginning. Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, he was amazing. He did a book, one of his last books was Bidayatul Hidayah, the beginning of guidance. And in the beginning of that is where he discusses that, look, everything has a nihaya, but you can't get to the end of any point of anything you want unless you start off with its proper beginnings. So that's a whole book dedicated to that. We've got a translation of that from White Thread Press that we produced many years ago, and many people have benefited from it. So that's his final book called Beginning of Guidance, right? Essentially, so there's this concept of the beginning, that every section of this path, if we were to separate them out, will also have a beginning. And that's what this Shaykh al-Makki al-Dimashqi is saying, that it's impossible to, without reforming the beginning of each path, the beginning stage, it's impossible to reach the nihaya. That's why Junaid al-Baghdadi rahimahullah is confirming that no one can attain the nihaya as long as he refrains from reforming the bidayah. That's why, according to some Sufis, they say corruption of the principles, the usul of haqiqah and ma'rifah, leads to the destruction of usul. Let me explain that term. Usul means to finally attain. Wasala means to reach. So since we're talking about this whole path now, the point of reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is called wusul. Another way to understand that is called ma'rifah, to recognize, to know, to become aware, to become cognizant of this whole path and recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And when a person does that, that's called a reality. To recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to recognize reality. When you see everything beyond its facade, for its reality, that's called haqiqah, right? So if we don't understand, if there's a corruption in terms of the understanding of the haqiqah and the ma'rifah, then we can't do wusul, we can't reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This is also, they say the claim, this is also something explained and established by Abu Sulaiman ad-Darani, another very famous individual from the early days who blazed the path for us. That's why he's saying it is therefore imperative to adorn the usul, the principles and the beginnings, the foundations, so that the road ahead opens up and the wusul is attained, which means the reaching the goal is attained. According to Junaid rahimahullah, the usul of the tariqah are 5 acts, right? The usul of the tariqah are the 5 acts, which we'll be covering inshallah. One of them is fasting during the day. If we can attain that, that's a really effective way of it. It's not that that fasting during the day, qiyam, salat, ibadah during the night, ikhlas in every single act, sincerity in every act, proper order and care in all actions. That's what we've been studying our fiqh for. And then trust in Allah in all conditions. If somebody can focus on all of these, then this will be very beneficial, and they can reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to conclude today's lesson, what we discussed today is that this particular module is going to be covering Islamic Sufism, spirituality. We discussed that there's various words for it like tazkiyah, spirituality, the path, wusul, or reaching the path. We discussed that the person on the path is called a salik. We discussed that it's all about attaining love for Allah. Some people have discussed it through the divine love idea. Some have discussed it through the renunciation of the world idea. Some have discussed it. One of the definitions that we read from the Risala al-Makkiyah is that it is discussing, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, how to rid the heart of all of the blameworthy traits and improve the behavior and the conduct and the perspective through the praiseworthy traits, and adorning the character with that, and elimination of the bad traits. That is essentially what suluk and tariqah was. We discussed that ultimately tariqah is the path of gaining wusul with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, attaining Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there are multiple things to do in the process, which is that you can't just get it by just fulfilling obligations, but you actually have to get it by doing extra acts, even the recommended acts, rather than just make it a habit of just fulfilling the obligation. While fulfilling the obligations is a good thing to do, but that's just a way, that's just enough to get us onto the path. The actual traversing takes place afterwards with all of the optional acts that we do to gain the divine pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to give up taking concessions all the time and do always taking discretions and so on. And then the big discussion after that was that the way to fulfill this and the way to get to the end is none other than to get to the nihaya, because there's an ending of this. There's only one way to do that, which is to get to sort out the beginning. The beginning could be that a human being can think of his own embryonic stage, was completely helpless and dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to get us to remove the ego, just as we didn't have an ego then, to get that in our adult life as well. And another one was that all of the path that we're talking about is broken up into smaller sections and manazil and so on. Each one of them also has a beginning and an end. Ultimately, the path is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but if you don't sort out the beginning, you can't sort out the end. So that's why sort out all of the beginning principles, and inshallah that will take us to the end point. And that's essentially what we were discussing today. Inshallah we will carry on with this discussion. We'll see you in the next session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.